Always by Your Side by Pale Series 7. My Uncle Ron had always been a quiet, anxious man. When I was a child under his care, I was honestly quite intimidated by his mannerisms and heightened awareness. Why, you may ask? Well, because he was blind. It wasn't just that he couldn't see, it was in the way that he carried himself. I thought he could feel the world in ways no one else could. He always seemed to know when I was nearby, even if I tried my hardest to sneak up on him. He'd tilt his head toward me and smile, his pale eyes locking onto mine like he was staring directly into my soul. "Always stay close," he'd tell me, "and know that I'll always be by your side, even if I'm gone." At the time, I genuinely thought it was comforting, even sweet, a way to make me feel secure, even in the face of his inevitable passing. However, I always felt that there was something he wasn't telling me. As I grew older, I noticed how much Uncle Ron had began to struggle. His blindness wasn't the calm acceptance I had assumed as a child, but it was a raging storm of fears and anxieties inside him. He'd often panic, episodes where he'd clutch at the walls or his chest, gasping for air. He would mutter to himself, pacing around as if trying to find his way out of something only he could see and feel. He never told me anything about what was going on with him, but I found that he would often confide in Aunt Lily. One such night, I was awoken by a loud crash. It was a thud, followed by a sharp sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I heard paced footsteps descend the staircase. I followed. It came from the living room downstairs, near the mantelpiece. I rushed to see Uncle sprawled on the floor, disoriented. The couch where he usually sat at that hour was close by. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, his pale eyes wide open, though lifeless. His walking stick was flung afar, across the room by the dining table. My aunt was kneeling beside him, holding his trembling hand and whispering softly. She comforted him. "It's all right, Ron. It's all right. You're here. You're safe now." He whimpered, his face twisting in pain. His voice, coarse and desperate, gasped. "Oh, dear, I shouldn't have killed. I'm cursed," he choked. Aunt Lily's head snapped up, her eyes meeting mine in the dim glow of the lamp. Panic flooded her face. Please, help him," she cried, her voice cracking. "He's not well. Get the water." The scene was unnervingly calm, yet frantic at the same time. My hands trembled as I fetched the water into a glass from the kitchen sink, my mind racing with questions. I was shaking with unexplained nervousness as I brought the glass of water to Aunt Lily. She coaxed Ron to sip on it, her voice trembling, her eyes exchanging nervous glances with me. I could see that Uncle's neck had grown darker, as if something had tried to strangle him. He didn't say another word that night and retired to bed with Auntie. I stood dumbstruck in the pitch darkness, reevaluating the scene I had just witnessed. It was more of a ritual of his, you know. I really didn't understand how he got down the stairs to sit on his couch in the living room, so deep into the midnight. He'd often sit by himself in the dim glow of the lamp, ruminating on thoughts I could only help but imagine. This time, it had felt different. The crash, the way his walking stick had been flung so far. It was as if something had struck him down. I couldn't catch much sleep that night, and as I woke up early in the morning, I tried asking Aunt Lily about what Uncle had said the previous night. She was unusually quiet, her face pale and hands shaking as she folded the laundry. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask her, what did Uncle mean last night? About killing someone? Her movements froze. I could see her visibly frightened. I anticipated an answer as her lips parted. Her eyes darted toward the window as if she was searching for words somewhere out there. Instead, she just sighed my question off, mumbling something about how his illness was making him ramble. "Don't take it to heart, dear," she dismissed. I couldn't let it go. Uncle Ron's health began to deteriorate rapidly after the next few nights. His panic attacks grew worse, and he barely left his room during the day. Yet, in the dead of the night, I would still hear the faint creak of his footsteps on the stairs and the distant groan of the couch as he settled into his usual spot in the living room. I'm pretty sure I remember hearing him talking to himself at that hour. Or maybe he had company. I never dared to go down again, not after that night. His promises grew more frequent. Every time I helped him with something as he lay ill, he'd try to express his gratitude, how I had been such a help to him, and how he would never forget what I was doing for him. It grew erratically frequent, even for the slightest, silliest of things. Fetching him his medicine, adjusting his pillows. He'd repeat, "I'd always be by your side." I brushed it off as his way of accepting his inevitable death and expressing his gratitude for what I did for him. His final days were quiet, almost eerily so. Aunt Lily barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was very short and curt. She spent most of her time by his bed, holding his hand, her eyes red from crying. When the end came, it was sudden. I had stepped out to fetch some groceries. By the time I returned, Aunt Lily was already on the phone. Her voice was trembling as she spoke in short, hurried sentences. I could see her face through the living room window before I even stepped inside. A pallor to her face, her eyes hollow as though something inside her had shattered. Uncle Ron was gone. I found him lying on the bed, unnervingly still, his pale eyes open, staring, arm twisted and finger pointing to the wall. His face was cold and calm, but had a slight sense of fright to it, as if his blind eyes had caught an apparition. I wondered if his death had been a relief for him, to escape whatever tormented him in life, and cleanse all the regret and remorse he had left with. His promise hit different that day. I could sense he was somewhere near. The funeral was somber, as expected, but it felt wrong in ways I'd rather not articulate. Friends and his distant relatives gathered, sharing warm memories of Uncle Ron, talking about his resilience, his kind spirit. I tried to smile, to nod along, yet I felt like an indifferent outsider among the mourners. At one point, the emotions caught up to me. I stepped away from the close gathering, trying to catch a breath. My chest tightened. Before I could stop it, tears rolled down my face. I sank onto a bench, wiping my eyes with my trembling hands. When I finally looked up at the distant gathering, composing myself, I saw someone. A man, standing still near the edge of the crowd. He looked too young to have been one of Uncle Ron's friends, maybe in his mid-40s. His blonde hair was combed neat, gleaming in the sunlight. His eyes were sharp blue, almost stark in their intensity, and his light eyebrows slightly frowned. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even somber. He was grinning. It wasn't a warm, comforting smile. It felt sinister. I could say it was charming, but there was an edge to it, like he knew something I didn't. I felt oddly drawn to him. I stared at him for a few moments, silently pausing my sobs. It was a strange contrast, and I was too overwhelmed to try and approach him. I didn't feel like talking to any stranger, and I'm sure Uncle Ron had many friends he hadn't introduced me to or talked about. It was likely someone who knew him, or perhaps a relative of the mourners. It was clear, as he was dressed in funeral attire. A Apart from his rather usual countenance, I could see a gilded amulet hanging from his neck. It gleamed in the sunlight, and it really caught my eye. In fact, I felt my eyes burn and feel heavy the longer I looked at it. It wasn't just shining, it felt like it was eating away my vision. I just wiped my eyes, took a deep breath, and turned my gaze away from him. I lost him in the crowd soon, or maybe he just left. The days after the funeral were oppressively quiet. The house, once filled with his mutterings, the rhythmic knock of his walking stick, and the faint shuffle of his footsteps, felt lifeless now. His uncanny absence made the silence deafening. The nights felt longer than the day, though. There was a notable stench all across the home, and the feeling of a stagnant, lingering presence that unnerved me. I found myself struggling to sleep. The nights were heavier, like the air pressed down on my chest. Shadows stood still too long in the corners of my room, and the faint creaks of the house settling felt too deliberate. Aunt Lily was faring worse. She avoided eye contact whenever we passed each other, and what little communication we had before had dwindled to nothing. We only spoke when something was urgent or unavoidable, her voice barely more than a whisper. I realized that she grew this habit of leaving the living room lamp on before going to bed. I never asked her why. I often heard her pacing in her room late at night. Occasionally, I caught the faint sound of her climbing the stairs to my room. She would stop just outside the door, lingering there anxiously, as if torn between stepping in and retreating. Then, one night, she came rushing upstairs to my room. I woke to the sound of her hurried footsteps. She didn't knock, just burst in, her face pale as the dim light spilled through the window. She was shaking, her hands clutching the doorknob so tightly her knuckles were white. Can I stay here tonight?" she stammered, her voice shaking. I blinked at her, still groggy, but the look on her face jolted me awake. I nodded, pulling the blanket aside as she dove into bed, curling up like a child seeking comfort. I didn't ask her what had happened, not right away. She seemed too shaken to talk, her eyes darting in the darkness. As she caught her breath, her voice broke the tension. I saw him," she said, softly. "Who?" "Ron," she croaked, her voice cracking. "He was sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to wake me up. He looked so troubled, so wrong." She shuddered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I heard him sobbing, whining as he rebuked himself. His voice, it was so hoarse, so strangled like he was suffocating on his own pain. His blind eyes, they were wide open. He saw me. He saw me. His face was so full of terror." She trembled, pressing herself closer. "I couldn't help it. I had to leave. It felt so wrong. Oh, forgive me, Lord." My chest began to feel uneasy, and I grew very anxious. I started to recall how Uncle had always told me that he'd be near, always looking after us. My mind began piecing these very disturbing thoughts. I don't want to talk about. Aunt Lily, she cried, and cried, and cried herself to sleep. I couldn't get any. The uneasy fear from her experience dried my throat. I tried to convince myself to not be scared. After all, he was my uncle. I had known him since I was a child. What was there to be afraid of? After what felt like hours in my thoughts of evaluating my unnecessary fears, I finally mustered up the courage to get myself a glass of water from the kitchen downstairs. It was pitch dark. We had shut all the lights off before us as we went to bed. The only light I could see was what reflected off the lamp by the couch in the living room. I recalled that night when Uncle Ron confessed to Aunt Lily. I dismissed any unfounded fears. I descended down the stairs and went across the dark hallway. The dim glow of the lamp in the living room guided me to the kitchen. As I crossed the couch, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling of being watched, like eyes on my back. I took a deep breath and hurried to the kitchen, my legs trembling. The water tasted cold and bitter, but it did absolutely nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. At least it quenched my thirst. The house was too quiet, and there was an uneasy stillness to the air. Then I heard it. A faint, uneven yet familiar knock. The sound of Uncle Ron's walking stick tapping on the floor, just beyond the kitchen door. I froze, almost choking on the water down my throat. The knocking came again, slower now, rhythmic, like someone was testing the air and measuring my fear. Suddenly, the lamp in the living room flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. I was blinded and could make nothing in my sight. I could see the couch in the living room, and my eyes, fixed on it as if expecting to see something, now started to make out a faint silhouette that seemed to grow darker. It was Uncle Ron. His head hung low, hands folded in his lap. His presence was almost unnerving, still and utterly eerie. He slowly looked up towards me, as if acknowledging my presence. In the blink of an eye, I flicked the light switch of the kitchen on, expecting to make the apparition disappear. I froze once again, and soon the kitchen light had died too. I ran. My feet pounded the stairs as the thuds of something chasing me rang in my ears, heavy, relentless in footing. At one moment, I felt someone tug at my collar, trying to pull me back. I rushed into my room and slipped into bed, locking the doors behind me, of course. The covers pulled over me as I tried to keep my breath steady. But sleep wouldn't come. Not at all. Not tonight. I could hear the doorknob twitch and move. I could feel his presence behind that door. Uncle Ron had promised he'd always be by my side. And now, I think I finally understand what he meant. Thank you guys for listening to this story by Pale Series 7. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. But until then, goodbye.